Are you guys as bricked up as I am right now? We got the TrimUI Brick. What is a brick? A brick is a small block typically made of fired or sun-dried clay. It's also the TrimUI Brick, a smaller vertical handheld by TrimUI, the makers of the TrimUI Smart, TrimUI Smart Pro, and a couple other retro handhelds. The brick has a vertical orientation, a very clean, minimal aesthetic. It has the same internals as the TrimUI Smart Pro, so you're looking at PSP as kind of your max limit on performance, but you're not really going to be playing too much 16:9 widescreen content like the PSP because this is a 4:3 screen. I'm very excited to check this handheld out because I have a lot of horizontal retro handhelds like the RG556, the Retroid Pocket 4, the Retroid Pocket Mini, and the Retroid Pocket 5. I just made a first impressions mini review on the Retroid Pocket 5. You can check that out by clicking the card in the top right corner. I'm a little biased to larger handhelds, but this one really caught my eye. It has a very clean, minimalist look to it that's reminiscent of an Analogue Pocket at a fraction of the price. But in this video, we're gonna do kind of a mini review, first impressions on the TrimUI Brick. Take a look at it, see how it feels, see how it plays, and talk about some of my initial thoughts on the device as a whole, so you can get an idea of what to expect from this handheld. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. The TrimUI Brick comes in this very nice box. It has a subtle texture to it. It feels very premium. This would make a great gift box. Seeing this kind of gets my heart beating a little bit. It's one of those boxes, so kudos to them. But upon closer inspection, the cracks start to show with some of the quirkiness. Purpose built to spark your imagination. Man, that really just inspires quality right there. Yep. Yes, sir. On the side, we have the TrimUI Brick logo, and on the other side, we have the brand, the model number, accent color, and the base color. There's currently 4 color options that you can get. All of them are very minimalist across the board, which I actually love. They have a clean look to them, very understated, very analog pockety. There's the black model, the red model, the purple model, which actually really caught my eye. If I like this, I might have to pick up the purple one, and the white model, the one that I picked up. On the back, we have some light specs here. We have 3.2-inch RGB lighting effect, stereo speakers, and extra LR keycaps ×2, which means we have actually some extra variants of the left and right bumper triggers, which should be pretty nice to be able to customize this thing a little bit. We have the layout of the device, numbered for no particular reason at all. It has a metal back shell, RGB lighting effect, we already know this, extra LR keycaps, we already know this, and easy disassembly, which is nice. I'll always take easier disassembly. And then at the bottom, we have what's included: the TrimUI Brick handheld, the console cable, user manual, and LR keycaps. Third time they had to mention it, they really wanted to drive that point home, huh? So let's check out what's inside the box. The TrimUI Brick comes in a soft sleeve with a foam cover. I love this size. I love this metal backplate. And the plastic is quite solid too. I'm gonna put this to the side and let's check out what else is in the box. An instruction manual, the long way, USB A to C cable, and those famous L&R keycaps that we've heard 3 times about so far. I love some customizability here, so shouts out to TrimUI. And nothing else in the box, so no major goodies besides those L&R key swaps. So here is the TrimUI Brick. Immediately, I'm noticing how premium this thing feels. It feels like they made all the right decisions for using materials that felt premium at a budget. Like having a top display with a very, very tiny bezel. It just screams premium handheld, and this thing is just solid feeling. So let's talk about the specs of the TrimUI Brick. It has a 3.2-inch 4:3 aspect ratio IPS screen with a resolution of 1024 by 768 pixels. And that resolution on a 3.2-inch screen means that the PPI, or pixels per inch, is quite a step above other retro handhelds. We have 2 front-firing stereo speakers, a start, select, and TrimUI button. We have 2 programmable function buttons that light up, a dpad, and ABXY buttons in the Nintendo layout. A on the right, B on the bottom, Y on the left, and X on the top. On the left side, we have volume up and down buttons. And on the right side, we have a unique function switch, the power and lock button in a very striking aquamarine color, and a TrimUI Brick logo stamped lower down. On the bottom, we have the micro SD card slot, a reset button, USB-C charging, a very small microphone, and a 3.5mm headphone jack. On the back of the device, we have a brushed metal top plate with the TrimUI Brick logo, 4 stacked shoulder buttons that are replaceable and customizable, and a nice waterfall texture with, you guessed it, the TrimUI logo stamped in. Under the hood, it's running Linux, so you can install operating systems like CrossMix OS or MinUI. The CPU is an all-winner A133 Plus, clocked at 1.8 GHz. The GPU is an Imagination Power VR GE8300 at 660 MHz. We have 1 whole gig of DDR3 RAM, 8 GB of internal eMMC storage, which should only store your operating system, nothing else. For connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 4 and Bluetooth 2.1. Needless to say, wired headphones only. We have a 3000 mAh battery, which should be very good for a device like this, and has a rumble motor. I'm very particular when it comes to rumble, so I'm curious how this stacks up. The spec sheet says that it's 73mm wide, 109.9mm tall, 20mm thick at the bottom, and about 11.8mm thick at the top. Now let's convert that to inches. We're looking at about 2.8 inches wide, about 4.3 inches tall, 3/4 an inch thick at the bottom, and just under 1/2 inch thick at the top. Now let's talk about how the brick compares in size to other devices that you might be more familiar with. Obviously, the first device to compare to is the Game Boy Color. The brick is significantly smaller than the Color, about the same thickness as the Game Boy Color at the top points, and slightly thinner than the Color at the bottom due to this AA battery slot on the back. I did a shell and screen swap on this, so it looks a bit better than your average Game Boy Color. Here's how it compares to the Retroid Pocket Mini. It's about 60% of the length. The Pocket Mini has a 3.7-inch display, and the TrimUI Brick has a 3.2-inch screen. The screens look similar because this has the black bezel on the outside. The center part of the Mini is slightly thinner than the base of the Brick. The length of the Brick is pretty much identical to the width of the PS Vita 2000 screen, and the Brick is about 30% taller than the Vita. The Brick is so small that it's only slightly bigger than the PS Vita's screen, and the Vita is about as thin as the top of the Brick. Comparing it to the Anbernic RG35XX SP, it's about 25% taller when the SP is closed, and when the SP is open, it's about 40% taller than the Brick. The SP has a 3.5-inch display, while the Brick has a 3.2-inch display. Again, the black bezel on the Brick is deceiving. Comparing to an iPhone 13 Pro, the iPhone is about 30% taller than the Brick. And as to be expected, the iPhone is significantly thinner than the TrimUI, even with a case on it. Here's how it stacks up to an Xbox Series controller. If you took the handles off the controller, it would be about the width of the TrimUI. And shocking no one, the Xbox controller is significantly thicker than the TrimUI. The screen is even smaller than the center part of the controller. And it fits perfectly in the middle of a Steam Deck. Now for my favorite part, let's take off this stock screen protector. The screen gets very smudgy very quickly, so you might want to pick up a screen protector for it. Let's take a closer look at the Brick. On the front we have a D-pad. The D-pad sits at a nice height, not too high or too low. It has a nice amount of give to it. It has solid conformation at the bottom without being too clicky. It doesn't bottom out when you press it, and it's very tactile and soft. And of course, TrimUI being TrimUI, we have a TrimUI logo on the D-pad, and above that we have another TrimUI logo, and we have a TrimUI logo button at the bottom, and on the right side we have a TrimUI logo, and on the back we have a TrimUI logo, and just to be safe, we threw one more TrimUI logo indented at the bottom just in case anything happens. Classic TrimUI, am I right? Anyways, moving over to the face buttons, they sit shallow and they're rounded at the top. They have a short travel, and when you press them down, you get a soft, satisfying click. It's a wonderful combination that's a big standout for this device. The Start, Select, and TrimUI buttons sit very low and they're very shallow, and they have a nice satisfying click when you press them in. In between the D-pad and the face buttons are 2 customizable function buttons. They have a dimmable light behind them. You can customize what these 2 function buttons do, but there's a 3rd function switch on the side here. So you can assign it to LED off, quiet mode, silent, CPU power save, performance mode, or turbo, any button. You can assign the function buttons to switch between D-pad and joystick, do a CPU clock swither. I've swithered my fair share of CPU clocks. You can change the LCD brightness. Man, they're on a roll with these ones. Or you can toggle the lights on and off. On the back, we have the 4 shoulder buttons, also with the dimmable light behind them, and textured backplate for your fingers to rest on. In between the shoulder buttons is another USB-C port that is for hosting. This is basically a way that you can transfer files from a USB flash drive, or you can plug in controllers or other accessories. But you can't charge from here. You gotta charge from down at the bottom. Looking closer at the 4 shoulder buttons on the back, each of the shoulder buttons sounds slightly different. These outside shoulder buttons are easier to press in, and they have a higher pitch click at the bottom. And the smaller L2 and R2 shoulder buttons are a little harder to press in and have a deeper and louder click. I find it quite annoying that these shoulder buttons are so loud and clicky. You get that plasticky click from the L2 and R2 buttons, and there's a similar click with the outer shoulder buttons as well. I wouldn't mind them as much if they were just as clicky but quieter, like the dpad and face buttons. Those are clicky but much softer and not as loud. But the shoulder buttons are very clicky, plasticky, and loud. The brick comes with these replaceable shoulder keys that the box made sure that we did not forget. These are the default shoulder buttons. They have a slight bump up in the middle. This is what the shorter ones look like. They look a little bit asymmetric on the right side. They're more rectangular on the outsides, and the centers kind of pop out a little bit more. These ones are way more angular. The L2 and R2 kind of look like Monopoly pieces. They're a lot more rigid and angular if you like that feeling on your fingers. Removing and replacing the shoulder buttons is very easy. You just put your thumb underneath and pop them right out. These aren't the highest quality buttons. The R2 is actually causing the button to get stuck right now. It just gets stuck in there and I have to pull it out. Luckily, it's not the buttons themselves, it's the keycaps. So it's nice to have different options. Let's power this on and check out the default OS. Immediately, the wind is taken out of my sails. I noticed this black outline here. So it's not edge to edge, but it still looks fantastic. The screen can get pretty bright, but not very dim. The stock operating system has a few options to tune the display. You can adjust the contrast, saturation, color temperature, and exposure. For default apps, we have function key setting, Moonlight for game streaming from your PC. I'd probably stay away from that. This has a Wi-Fi 4 chip in it, so you're not gonna get good streaming performance. We have a media player, USB storage, which you'll use to access USB devices through this port. It has NetPlay, so you can play wireless multiplayer with any device that supports NetPlay. It's easier if they're on your Wi-Fi, but you can do over the internet too. So a fun little quirk about the default operating system, even if you turn off your background music after you lock it and then unlock it later, the background music will just come right back on. Then you have to go back into the settings, turn it off again, and then you lock it, turn it back on, and it'll do the same thing. Hopefully this bug is patched in a future firmware update. So I'm gonna install a different OS called MinUI on here, and I'll talk about my reason for choosing that a little later. But for now, let's play some games and see how they run and feel, and talk about what you can expect from the TrimUI Brick. Starting with the SNES, these games scale very well to fill out this screen. The 4:3 display is a little wider than the original 8:7 aspect ratio, so you'll have to stretch them if you want to fill out the screen. They play perfectly and they feel great. It's a lovely combination to play SNES games on a Game Boy-like device. F-Zero also runs great. Controls are crisp and extremely responsive. The soft but clicky feedback is a really nice feeling. F-Zero always gets my competitive side a little charged up, so I wasn't paying too close attention to the visuals, but games look colorful and sharp. You'll have a lot of fun playing SNES. Game Boy and Game Boy Color games feel right at home on the Brick. It's like a smaller, upscaled Game Boy experience, and the colors pop. You can also add nice retro filters like grid or lines to replicate older Game Boy Color screens. I couldn't really capture it on camera, so I tried to capture it on my phone, but trust me, it's a really nice, subtle touch that brings back that handheld nostalgia. And when it comes to Pokemon, the Brick is a great Pokemon device. It's easy to grab it, turn it on, and hop right back in, and the function keys are clutch for speeding through slow parts. I prefer to keep Game Boy Color games at their original aspect ratio because stretching them out looks a little too wide. Game Boy Advance has been my favorite console on the Brick. The games look, feel, and play perfectly. And we have the same filter options as the Game Boy Color. I like the line filter for Game Boy Advance because it reminds me of the original GBA. And I also keep the fast forward button on a function key so I can speed through dialogue and get to gaming faster. Now looking at Nintendo DS, DS is a pretty compromised experience in MinUI. With janky, practically non-existent touch controls, the current build just doesn't work well with the TrimUI Brick. I can't figure out how to scale it to full screen, and performance barely runs full speed. And on top of that, there's some audio crackling, so I set it to run with automatic frame skip to smoothen the gameplay a little bit. Nintendo 64 is an even more compromised experience. There's tons of graphic glitches and bad performance. MinUI just doesn't play N64 well on the Brick. It also doesn't have an analog stick or C buttons, and I couldn't find a menu to bind controls or any of that, so this is not an N64 handheld, that is for sure. Especially with Tony Hawk 2. That menu screen is looking like hieroglyphics, man. Moving into PS1, this console scales excellently and performs very well. I'm glad to see that we have at least one console from this generation that runs well. And this is an emulator that has that simple menu interface in MinUI, which makes changing settings and saving and loading save states just so easy. But I did have an issue in Ridge Racer Type 4, where the default MinUI controller was set to DualShock, and that didn't work with Ridge Racer. So I changed it to standard, and it worked immediately, so I saved the settings just for this game, and had no other problems with this system. Surprisingly, we can run Persona 3 on the PSP pretty well, and I tweaked the aspect ratio so it'd fill up more of, but not the entire screen. Otherwise, it would feel a little too stretched. More demanding 3D titles like LEGO Star Wars 2 didn't run nearly as well. You have to enable automatic frame skip to get a playable frame rate, but after doing that, you should be looking at 20 to 40 FPS, with frequent frame dips, but it is technically playable. On the back end, there's quite a few software and hardware bugs with this emulator. We'll touch on those in a little bit, but I would not consider this a PSP handheld. Any PSP games that do run should be considered a bonus. MinUI also has support for Pico 8 games, so I played Celeste, and I beat it 5 minutes quicker than my Metroid Pocket 5 high score. The soft, clicky, tactile controls are a perfect fit for a precision platformer like Celeste. As we saw, performance on the TrimUI Brick is kind of a mixed bag. The chipset in here paired with MinUI is a pretty nerfed experience on the performance side. What you gain in simplicity and streamlining consoles, you lose in performance and the ability to play other consoles. DS is mediocre, Saturn doesn't work, and Dreamcast doesn't have an analog stick dpad swap key. But to my surprise, PSP was actually somewhat playable. And what I mean is that it's not as bad as I was expecting. I originally didn't even bother recording PSP footage, but I tried it out later and it was so good that I went back and recorded some gameplay footage of it. However, there's some major bugs with the hardware in this emulator. Pressing the power button or holding it wouldn't shut off the device. It would just make the volume go max level all of a sudden, even if the mute switch is on. And also, starting a game with the switch muted has the opposite effect. It also just maxes out the volume instantly. Flipping the switch on and then back off again fixes this, but there's a few bugs with some of these emulators, and kind of the operating system as a whole right now. Ambient lighting also doesn't work in MinUI, and some of the emulators are just kind of janky. I'm looking at you, Drastic. Speaking of hardware, I kind of want to talk about the shape and profile of this handheld. The TrimUI Brick is a really fun size. It's small enough to carry around in your pocket, and it's just heavy enough to feel solid when you're using it. It doesn't feel like a cheap plastic handheld, it's just sturdy and good. The profile feels like a small Game Boy without a cartridge. When I reach into my pocket and grab it, there's always kind of like a oof moment where I feel like it's missing a cartridge and I won't be able to play my games. But that's just grabbing the back here. Looking at the front, everything looks excellent on the Brick. The high resolution screen is rich, colorful, and very bright. I'm usually playing games below 50% brightness. The face buttons and D-pad are super tactile and clicky in a good way. They're crisp and fit the Brick perfectly. You get a soft confirmation with every button push that's pretty satisfying. They're excellent buttons for pick up and play gaming. The stacked shoulder buttons are a weak point that feel pretty cheap, but they're usable. They don't stand out as the worst shoulder buttons, but they are far from good. Now to talk about the comfort, the TrimUI Brick is best fit for shorter play sessions. 30 minutes here and there, maybe an hour on the couch. You probably wouldn't want to do longer gaming sessions on this. Testing all the games took about 4 hours, so my hands were pretty cramped by the end. The most comfortable grip is what I like to call the butterfly grip, where you don't have shoulder button access, but the front buttons are easy to use. This kind of grip is common with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Now moving on to the software, we looked at the default OS earlier, but I didn't do any game testing on that because I ended up installing MinUI instead. Setting up MinUI and loading ROMs and configuring folders was honestly painful. If you hate the thought of tinkering around, rearranging folders, hand selecting ROMs and BIOS files, then you might just want to use the stock OS or grab a pre-configured SD card. MinUI took a while to set up and configure, but the result is awesome and feels personal to me. It made this feel like it's my handheld. MinUI is kind of the perfect OS pairing with the Brick. It's an excellent combination of clean and simple aesthetics that just makes sense. Getting it up and running is exhausting, but it's well worth it, and tweaking settings, controls, and filters are dead simple. MinUI inherently gives up some performance and optimization, but that brings me to my next point with the lower end handheld like this. For me, the TrimUI Brick works best when it's dedicated to a limited collection of pocket-friendly games. And that all starts with being pretty picky when it came to loading my ROM collection, and making sure to reduce any fluff and keep it to only games that I'm actually gonna play. My ethos with this handheld is one word: intentionality. Spending time to remove the games that I'm not gonna play, keeping console libraries to 2 to 4 pages max, and configuring emulators to be on-the-go friendly. So fast forward and save states are a must. When we shift focus to the hardware side, the cracks start to show. Literally. There's a small gap between the display and the right side, so charging it has a pretty distracting light bleed. It's an extremely bright, razor-thin light bleed that's pretty annoying when it hits your eye at a certain angle. The default charging light brightness is also pretty bright. While we're on the topic of charging, I did a quick voltmeter test, especially after I saw the warning on the back of the Brick. Yeah, nothing I love more than risking explosion and a fire to play a couple retro games, right? But the Brick seems to regulate charging pretty well. I'm not gonna say charge it with any cable you want. Obviously, only can use certified charger like it says, but I like to live on the edge sometimes. So I tried charging it with a USB-C power delivery cable, and it ended up regulating it down to 5 volts, 1.6 amps, which was about 8 watts. Theoretically, this means charging will take about like 2 hours, but we'll do some real testing in the full in-depth review. Now to talk about sound, these two speakers get kinda loud, but it's all mids. There's some distortion and sharpness on certain frequencies. It's pretty much in the middle of a quality scale. It's not terrible speakers, but they're nowhere near good. Here's a comparison to the Ambient RG35XX SP. As you can tell, the speakers on the Brick versus the SP are very different experiences. The SP has a mono speaker and the Brick has 2 stereo speakers. And while this is heavily tuned to the mid frequencies, the Ambient sounds like it has a paper towel over it, which kind of reduces the sharpness at the cost of clarity. So again, kind of middle of the spectrum, not terrible, but not great. And lastly, the time that it takes to power on the Brick is on the slower side. Here's a quick time test. I'd love to see this time cut in half, then this would really feel pick up and play. But there is one great benefit about MinUI. You can turn the Brick off while you're playing it, and it'll automatically create a save state. And then when you turn it back on, it'll put you right back into your game where you left off. You can also load any game normally, or if you click X, then it'll load you into the most recent save state. For me, the overarching goal with the TrimUI Brick is reducing the time it takes from picking it up to getting into my game. If you're like me, you want to pick this up and get right back into your games. I think as the software experience improves on here, we'll be able to reduce that time and get into our games sooner. Now, the Brick is still very new, so custom OS support might take a while to really mature. But I think that once we have more options like MuOS and Newly, it'll really set this handheld apart from others. I think this hardware is really limited by the operating systems right now. Now, let's talk about value. The TrimUI Brick costs between $50 and $100. Lower if you supply your own microSD card, and higher if you get a custom one. So let's call it $75. The value you're getting from this handheld is exceptional in my opinion. It has no right looking and feeling this premium at $75. I got mine on AliExpress for $55 US, but again, that might be a little higher depending on where you get it. The TrimUI Brick is very inviting. The soft clickiness of the buttons, the simple but purposeful MinUI OS, and above all, the gaming experience are all amazing high points. It's a lovely handheld that's perfectly suited for just jumping into a game. By no means is this going to be my primary retro handheld. It's a bit too limiting for gaming beyond PS1 and Game Boy Advance. I'd consider the Brick to be more of a secondary handheld, for those situations where you might be on the bus or it's late at night and you just want to play a few minutes of Zelda before bed. It's an excellent, high quality pick up and play handheld. So that's my first impressions, kind of mini review of the TrimUI Brick. I'm going to spend some more time with the Brick and make an in-depth review about it. Subscribe below if you want to see that and other handheld videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Later. If you like this video, you might be interested in my Retroid Pocket 5 first impressions review. It's a powerful mid-size handheld that can run GameCube, PS2, and even some Switch and Wii U games, all for under $250. You can check out that video here.